In this video, we're going to continue talking about correlation, and specifically we're going to focus on the patterns of correlation and direction of correlation. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with you and we'll get started. There are three patterns of correlation: linear, curvilinear, and no correlation. The first pattern that we'll discuss is the linear correlation. A linear correlation is when the relationship between two variables is visible on a scatter plot as approximately a straight line. As we can see in this example, it doesn't matter if that line is sloping downwards or upwards, as long as the pattern that's created by the general trend of the dots on the scatter plot creates a straight line. It's a linear relationship. There are two different kinds of linear relationships: positive correlations and negative correlations. And this is where we get into that idea of direction that I mentioned will be important when we discuss correlation. A linear correlation that's a positive correlation means that as one variable gets bigger, so does the other. And by that same logic, as one variable gets smaller, so does the other. In other words, high scores go with high scores and low scores go with low scores. The variables move in the same direction. Both scores get bigger, both scores get smaller. Remember that when we're looking at a scatter plot and we're thinking about a correlation, each dot on this plot represents one person, but two different variables. There's scores for two different variables for that particular person. And so a positive correlation means that as the scores go more towards the right for our horizontal variable, those scores are going to be also more likely to be further up for our vertical variable. So for instance, we can see that we have one dot here that's our furthest dot towards the right has a score of 10, and that score for happy mood on our vertical axis has a score of 6. Whereas scores that fall more towards the left for our horizontal axis also fall lower for our vertical axis. So for instance, the person who got only 5 hours of sleep rated their mood at 2. And so these correlations are going to slope always, positive correlations are always going to slope from that bottom left up towards that top right in this general shape. For a negative correlation, it's going to be the opposite. If a positive correlation means that both variables move together, both getting bigger or both getting smaller, a negative correlation means that as one variable gets bigger, the other gets smaller. They're moving in different directions. It's an inverse relationship. In other words, high scores go with low scores and low scores go with high scores. On the scatter plot that we see here, we see board with relationship on our x-axis or horizontal axis, and we see marital satisfaction on the y-axis or the vertical axis. And we can see that the slope of this line is the opposite of that of the positive correlation. This goes in this direction, with our slope of our line moving from the upper left to the bottom right. In this case, again, there's this reverse relationship for each individual on both of these variables. So for instance, more boredom with a relationship equates to less marital satisfaction, but less boredom equates to more marital satisfaction. There's a relationship between these variables. It's in the opposite direction. Our next pattern is a curvilinear relationship. And a curvilinear relationship, unlike a linear relationship, is when the relationship is not a straight line. We can't draw a single straight line in this case. Our line is curved. The example that we see here on the scatter plot shows kindness on our horizontal axis and desirability on our vertical axis. And what we can see here is that as far as how these variables are related, that relationship changes at a certain point. Where that graph starts to curve marks a change in the relationship. So to begin with, if we look at just the left of this graph, we can see that as kindness increases, desirability increases. And if that continued, we'd have a linear relationship. We'd have a positive linear relationship. But instead, we see at a certain point, this graph starts to curve. And as kindness increases, as that line continues to move towards the right, desirability actually levels off. We don't continue to see an increase in desirability. It stays the same even though kindness is increasing. So even though someone might continue to be more kind, it doesn't mean that we're going to desire them more. At a certain point, that stops and desirability remains the same. And so because there's this change in the variable, there's not a linear relationship. It's not just a single kind of relationship. We get this curvilinear relationship. And there's other kinds of variables that we'll see this relationship with as well. So for instance, anxiety and achievement oftentimes shows this kind of curvilinear relationship. And in this case, it might actually be a U-shaped curve, something that goes in more of an upside down U in that case. In which case, for instance, if we have a lot more anxiety, to some degree, anxiety and achievement go together. Anxiety might motivate us to study more, and with more anxiety to a certain point, we might see more achievement. But at a certain point, anxiety starts to have the opposite effect. The relationship between anxiety and achievement changes at that point. And at a certain point, with too much anxiety, we might actually see that anxiety starts to impair performance. It starts to cause problems and maybe makes us unable to perform well on an exam if we're too anxious about it. And so we actually see that after that particular point, more anxiety means less achievement or lower grades in this case. And so we can see these curvilinear relationships with different kinds of variables. But if that relationship is changing over time, if we can't draw a straight line from it or our line is curved, it's going to be a curvilinear relationship. And last but not least, we have no correlation. And this is what a scatter plot for no correlation would look like. And in this case, what we see is that there's no systematic relationship between two variables. These variables are unrelated. The dots are spread everywhere, and there's no line, straight or otherwise, that is any reasonable representation of a trend here. We see in this particular scatter plot where we see shoe size on our horizontal axis and creativity on our vertical axis, that the dots just are spread all over the graph and seem to form a cloud, but there's no visible pattern here. And so this shows no correlation.